My name is Eric North. I'm an assistant professor here at UNL. For those, I think I know most everybody in this room. I feel like we should do introductions. So this last summer, I helped lead a trip to Botswana, which is a study abroad course for UNL students, primarily. Most of them were in fisheries and wildlife. And while we were there, we looked at, students in fisheries and wildlife think they're mostly just going to look at animals. And I convinced students and other people that we should look at more than just animals. So this is going to be kind of a little tour of the trees and some of the wildlife that we saw while we were in Botswana. And I will be doing a second one of these on the 18th, which covers more of the teaching and education that actually happens while doing a study abroad course. So more of the student interaction. This is going to be sort of like vacation slides, but cool. Okay. So if you're unfamiliar with where Botswana is, it's basically at the southern portion of Africa, so just above South Africa. So it's actually below the equator. So when we were there in May, it was their winter time, which wasn't particularly cold, but it is also their dry season. And the little marker there is where our camp was. So that's where we spent the bulk of our actual time, right? So we flew into South Africa and then drove up about 6 or 7 hour drive into Botswana. So that gives you some idea of where we were actually at, okay? This is what it looked like. This is the actual Mashatu Reserve in the Tuli Block, okay? So this land is set aside specifically for wildlife reserve or game preserve, okay? Non-hunting, wildlife viewing, eco-viewing, okay? This is called a savanna or bushveld, right? Which basically means you get a few tall trees here and there, but a lot of it's more shrub layer, right? And so this was actually, I took this photo standing on top of something called Solomon's Wall, which is a rocky outcrop of dolomite. So you get a really nice view throughout. You can see, even though it's winter there, it's still fairly green. So really kind of a beautiful landscape, right? This is what the camp looks like. This camp here. I won't spend too much time on the 18th. I'll talk more about what the camp was like and what it was like living in the camp. But to note, there were no fences, gates, or anything around this camp. So we had lions in camp, elephants in camp, hyenas in camp, students in camp, right? This is what we lived in, tents on the ground for a month. So we were there for an entire month. Also, nothing protecting you except the canvas walls, right? So everybody made it back. This is what most students sort of envisioned their time in Africa would be like. Right, this is Parker. He's riding on the front. We put him in the tracker seat because it attracts animals if you wave a student. No, basically the tracker seat is up there so that the student sitting there can look on the ground and actually see whether or not they see animal prints. And so then we can divert or stop and see if we can see whatever is out there, right? And so, but I couldn't help but look at the trees, right? As we're walking around, people are like, lion. It was like, tree, right? Far different than what people were looking at or what they thought they were going to get as part of their experience. This is what everybody thought, right? All these photos, I should say, are actually mine. These are photos we took there. Some of the students have great photos as well, right? It's hard to take a bad picture of stuff like this, right? Right? Elephants, of course, you think, elephants, it's Africa, right? Lions and elephants. This is what you expect to see. Giraffes. Really interesting fact I've learned about giraffes. I've been to both Botswana and Kenya. Every single giraffe, if you stop to take a picture, will stop whatever it's doing and look directly at you. Every picture I have of giraffes, they're all turned and looked directly at me, which is sort of interesting. The thing I learned about elephants is whoever came up with the phrase, "they're as loud as a herd of elephants," has never heard a herd of elephants because they're actually very, very quiet. You would sometimes see a herd go past you and you would barely notice that they were there. It's amazing how quickly such a large animal can disappear under bush and tree cover, right? Leopards, we saw leopards, right? You can see leopards move kind of quick, right? They're hard to catch. They're hard to spot. They blend in very, very well. We see leopards, so students were really excited to be able to see this. Right?
Eric, those are your pictures?
These are all mine, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. This was a mother leopard and her cub, right? So kind of a juvenile leopard still coming through. This is cheetah. This is basically what they do. It's supposedly the fastest cat in the world. I've seen a cheetah run once. It was running away from a lion. Most of the time when you see cheetah, they're just doing this, sleeping with their heads propped up. Sometimes you'll see them in groups of 2 or 3, right? Really kind of fascinating, though. This is why people go to Africa. Right? Amazing wildlife. You can see wildebeest, maybe a lesser known, but still quite an impressive thing to see as they're walking around, right? Usually just see 1 or 2 together. Occasionally we'd see a herd of them going, playing or grazing, especially in the evening, right? Black-backed jackal, super cool, right? As a dog person, I sort of like the black-backed jackal. Zebra, fantastic, right? Another iconic sort of African species. You know you're in Africa because you see zebras, you saw elephants, you saw lions. What I was really trying to do is encourage students and to encourage others that we were with, even some of the guides that were focused mostly on animals, although all of our guides knew the natural history of the area very, very well. I wanted them to look at this, right? Look at that, narrow-leaf mustard tree. Lots of things you can tell about this. One, if you walk by these things, they have a really, really pungent odor. If you break apart anything, it's got a really distinctive odor to it. And you can see the browse line right here, right at the base. This is browse line. This is the animal browse line, right? You can start to tell things about what animals you might see in the area. So vegetation, trees, plants are really important. I keep telling students wildlife conservation is about all of the wildlife, including the static stuff like the plants, right? You have to conserve that because it's part of the habitat. But it's not just habitat, it actually is wildlife in and of itself, right? Here we see kudu. This is what I see, right? I see the fever tree, Croton megalobotrys, right? The kudu just happened to be there, right? Nice picture, but the plants, right, it's important. These animals use the plants to hide behind, they use them for food, right, all sorts of things. Here, who doesn't love a baby animal, right? But what about the baby mopane, right? Super cool, right? You see lots of trees all over the place, and it's really important that we don't just look at, I mean, the animals are really easy to sort of have a great experience with, but the more you understand about the landscapes that you're in, the more you can find all sorts of interesting things, right? In terms of the interactions of plants, the interactions of animals, right? And how these things make an entire landscape together that's really something fun and impressive to look at, right? The more you know. As you start looking at plants, you start noticing all sorts of other little things. That's the elephant shrew, the small big five, right? One of the small big five. Really tiny, but when you start looking for more than just lions and elephants, right, and giraffes, these big, big things, you start to see these little things that are often just as impressive and sometimes much harder to spot, right? Look at this, a locust, right? This was found by one of my students. We were there in the winter, and so the insects were not particularly out, right, because it was cold, and the mornings are not cold for me, but cold for others, right? It was about 40 degrees in the mornings, usually when we'd get up, and so when we'd start our walks for the day, any insects you did see tend to be sort of frozen in place. They didn't really move around, so you could find them, and then as the sun would heat them up, they'd kind of pop off. But the locusts, right, really cool. Okay? I think once you start noticing plants, you start noticing other things because you start taking a closer look, right? If you're just looking for elephants, you can see them from quite a distance off, right? You've got a telephoto zoom, you've got binoculars, you can see these things as close up as you like, but you start looking at plants and you start having to take a closer look, right? And then you find cool stuff like little insects. Right? This one happens to be on a plant, it's an invasive plant, Dervilia, which is a flowering plant in the riverbed. This is a katydid, right? Really, really well, near perfectly camouflaged. You can't see this if you're just tromping through, right? So in order to actually find stuff like this, which is really cool, right? So we were stopping to look at this particular plant because it is an invasive. And so plants can be both helpful and problematic, but you need to be able to identify them if you want to better the habitat for whatever your management strategy is. So plants are an incredibly important part of any wildlife conservation, right? Just as important as conserving the animals, right? As conserving the habitat. And that means you have to understand the plants. You have to understand exactly what it is that you're looking at, right? Saw these, a golden orb weaver. If you're wondering how big this was, it was about this big, right? Really huge. So probably 6 to 8 inches from leg tip to leg tip, right? There were 3 of these. Yeah, some shaking heads, some people with nightmares this evening. These were huge. They were all over camp. But you only notice them if I started saying things like, look, feverberry tree, right? And then you go, wow, golden orb spider, because they would tend to sort of have these big webs in between the trees themselves. And there were about 3 or 4 of these that were around camp that were hanging out by where we were eating and occasionally having volleyball games, right? Things like that. And they didn't really move much. This particular one, we'll call him Frank. Frank just kind of hung out there, right? He didn't really move much, just stayed in that one spot for almost the entire month that we were there, right? Really incredible sort of creatures, even if they're a little creepy, right? If you're creeped out by spiders. But you wouldn't notice this if you were just looking off in the distance, always looking for the next big thing, right? Looking around, looking close at your environment, looking at what's happening is really sort of fun. So this is okwa. Okwa is really responsible for a lot of what we learned about the environment in Botswana. Okwa, along with all the other guides that were part of our little training group, took around, and as I mentioned earlier, they were really good at understanding the plants, the animals, the landscape, even the rocks, right, and sand formations, the rivers, knowing not only what happens and how to track animals, but also how to read the landscape. And Okwa really spent a lot of time looking out. You knew you were okay. So Okwa grew up in the Okavango Delta, which is in the northwestern corner of Botswana, where it's fairly wet. He grew up there living in a traditional hut, hunting for food, and then education in Botswana was free, I believe, up to about 13, 14, 15 years old. And then you had to pay if you wanted to essentially go into a high school. His family didn't have money to pay initially, so he became a wildlife guide. So he started guiding, and he grew up there. So we knew everything was cool. We had guides from all over the place. We had guides from England, we had South Africa, New Zealand, we had an American guide. And sometimes they'd get a little spooked by something, and you just look over at Okwa, and if he was still just chilling, drinking his coffee, you're like, it's fine, right? If Okwa's not scared, I feel fine, right? Because he was very well attuned, and it's part because he just knew this stuff, right? He grew up there. He grew up working in these systems. And so we'd often see Okwa, we'd be out around the students, either on a kind of a break from the hike, or we'd be out doing something, looking at something specific, and Okwa would find kind of a perch to look out so he could be watching and scanning the landscape. And sometimes he'd do that not only as protection, you can see he's got a rifle with him. So this is not a protected area in terms of fences, right? There, a lion could certainly come up to you, right? Elephants, giraffes, we had to pay attention. We had to walk in single file, essentially, right? And if he saw something of interest, he would say, we should go over there. There's some stuff happening. We should go check it out. If he saw something of danger, he'd say, we should go over there, right? There's something we don't want to check out that's over here, and direct us around. Great guy, right? Okwa's now, little plug because he's such a great guy, but Okwa is got his own company now where he does wildlife expedition safaris. Really, they do tented camps. And he was one of the, I've been to, like I mentioned, in Africa a couple of times, and Okwa's definitely one of the best guides because he knows more than just the animals. He really knows what's happening on these landscapes and in these landscapes. So really fascinating. You could go to the most obscure little plant growing out of the ground and be like, Okwa, what's this? And if he couldn't remember the name, he'd know what it was for. Right? A lot of plants had uses, or he'd know where to find it again. Right? And he definitely knew how to find it. Great. So here he is, Okwa, teaching students about plants. I promise that some of them don't look thrilled in that picture. They all had a good time learning about plants, right? But it was basically looking at this. This is a plant that had lots of great uses that students also didn't like because I asked them the scientific name of this plant and they were unprepared for that. But we saw it. This was all over. In fact, this was the first thing you could smell when we drove in. Right? It's called wild sage. So you could smell that. Also great because a month long in a bush camp with sort of running water, people don't smell good after a while. And silky sage is a nice way to put in your boots, right? We did have water and things like that, but it's limited. So it's a dry system, right? So knowing that you could pick silky sage and kind of stuff it in your socks and your boots kind of help with odor eating, right? It's very effective at that. Really kind of a cool plant. Plus, when you're walking around, just to kind of grab a handful, to rub it around in your hand, right? Really fantastic odor to it. So by about the second week or so of the trip, students would go, hey, cool zebra. Also, look at this, an umbrella thorn. I was like, yeah, I have an impact. So we'd see these. This is kind of that iconic tree in Africa, especially in the savanna and these bushvelds. Right, stands up this very nice umbrella-like, right, very thorny. This used to be in the, if you follow botany and botanical things, this used to be acacia. It's now been moved into Vechilia. Some of our guides were very upset about this classification. Taxonomists, to me, do all sorts of weird things. The plant remains the plant, so I don't really care that its name changes, other than I have to relearn how to spell things, but really kind of cool, right? So students started pointing these things out to me, which was great. Here, look at that. You see a little kudu, right, head popping up, but you also see, look at that, Lucium schizocalyx, which apparently didn't really have a common name that anybody knew. And then at the top, this is wild sage, or its, right, kind of funky hyphenated genus and species name. Right? Really interesting. But you start to see this, right? So not only do we see the kudu kind of hiding behind, but you start to learn that if I see these types of plants, I might see these types of animals. Right? Instead of seeing through these things or past them, you start to see the landscape as a living thing, right? The entire landscape, not just the animal. Here, right, that's the cheetah from earlier, right? Initially, students were like, cheetah, and then a couple of students were like, shepherd's tree, right? You can tell which students got the A's, which students did not. Really cool, right? So we use trees as shade. Turns out so do animals, right? Lounging. Shepherd's tree, named that by shepherds. Because they would, when moving flocks around, would basically go under these trees, right? For shade. Oftentimes they were browsed up enough, right? And it's albitrunca because the trunks are white. Now these trunks are not particularly white because they also get rubbed on by animals like elephants, right? Or other animals, clawed on, rubbed on. So you could tell actually movement of animals or if they were prevalent in an area based on what the trees look like. Where was the browse line? How much of the bark was rubbed off? Right? Historically, what animals might you see in a particular area? There's a funny story about a student who lost one of my tools, and we were measuring some trees and he lost something called a clinometer. It's kind of an expensive tool somewhere in the African bush. We keep thinking a baboon is out there measuring trees somewhere. And at one point, the students asked if I could assign them each a tree. Kyle became the stinky shepherd's tree because he lost the clinometer. So Kyle, if you're watching, that's for you. At one point where students were walking around and at the beginning or before they had this trip, students might have looked at a landscape like this, particularly wildlife students, right? Because they're focused on wildlife and the interest in wildlife. Might have looked at this landscape and said, well, nothing to see here, right? Let's move on. I don't see anything in particular. And they started seeing things in particular. Anthozercus zambesiaca, which a couple of students still delight in running up to me and saying, since we made them memorize these things, right? And apple leaf, right? That's the one on the right. Apple leaf was really cool because its leaves didn't necessarily look like apple leaves, but when they were brown and dried out, if you grab them and you crush them in your hand, it sounded just like somebody taking a bite out of an apple, right? Really cool. The one next to it, the darker one, that's the Mashatu tree, or the Nalala tree, if you're from South Africa. So yeah, again, right? Students looked at that initially and were like, yep, tree, great. By the end, they were like, tree, great, right? A lot of hugging of trees throughout the course. Really an amazing way to connect students, not just with the wildlife, but also with the landscape, to understand more what's happening, right?
Did you do any coordinating to see how old a tree like that was?
We did not do any coordinating. We talked about it, but given that it's a wildlife preserve, doing anything like that seemed beyond what we even wanted to ask about. Yeah. So let me start. So I called this the Botanical Big Five, right? Because if you go, you go to take an African safari, if you're so lucky to be able to do so, a lot of times they will advertise, you'll see the Big Five, right? Which means the Big Five of the animals. And we really I wanted to get students and other people to think about the botanical Big Five. I would make a push that we could do this worldwide, like each state or each country could have a botanical things you should just see because they're cool, right? Leadwood is one of them, Combretum imberbe, right? Really amazing tree. Here you can see its seeds, which I just think seeds on plants are really fascinating to me. Lots of different ways in which they've evolved to sort of move around in the environment or be well adapted to be planted. So you can see that this seed, it's basically a winged seed. The seed is in the very center and the wings there, kind of four-sided. Really unusual, right? We don't see that here very often. Christian is telling me, yes, we see that all the time. I would say that you don't see it as often as you do other things, right? Academics, we're always disagreeing, right? Really interesting foliage, right? Really speckled, had kind of an interesting texture to it. Simple leaf, right? You can kind of see what it's like, but it made it easier to actually identify this because the coloring, that white speckling on that coloring, on the foliage there, gave it a coloring that even from a distance you could kind of see that it was just a little lighter in color, right? So you got a little bit of form, but if you compared with something else, you could see that it wasn't as dark as something like the Mashatu tree, right? So you could start to see these differences as you're walking up to or approaching. This is what the canopy looked like, so higher canopy, single trunk. Very interesting about this tree. If you were to burn some of the wood, you can get an ash from it. And the ash could be mixed with a little bit of water and used as a toothpaste. Okay. Kind of cool. Here you can see just standing alone on the landscape, right? We're in a savanna area, so not a heavily forested area, so you tended to see bigger trees like this. This one is amazing because these trees would live for hundreds of years. What's even cooler about it is that the wood on these, you can see this has a little bit of bark here, but a lot of areas where it's missing bark, right? It's no longer living in that particular section. And the trunks were often used, and you'd see them around. Part of this reserve was an old farm area, and you'd still see leadwood as fence posts because the wood itself would last for decades. Extremely hard, very, very dense, hence the name leadwood, right? If you were making a canoe, this is a bad choice, right? Had a lot of cultural significance, likely in part due to how long they would live in the landscape, but also how long standing dead trees would last. Right? Other trees die, and within a few months to a year or so, they're broken up and they're falling apart. Leadwoods can stay on the landscape for quite a while, which caused there to be some legend around this, right? That the leadwoods basically had the souls of ancestors in it, right? People passed. So has a really special meaning for the people in the area, right? And so you can see these are a group of the students, right? Really actually took to this. And so these stories that we tell about trees, even these little legends and things like that, mythologies, right? They're really important to connect people with the landscape. But the tree itself also has interest for wildlife purposes, conservation. This is a reason to conserve something, right? Let's see, look at that. I told you there'd be more students hugging things, right? It's easier to hug a tree than a lion, as it turns out. More recommended, right? So you can see that even with the students, as you start to talk about these things and you start to point out and they really look at these, right? You can really get a sense for what it can do to connect people to other efforts that might be going on, right? The mopane, really cool tree. This is actually a compound leaf, so it's two leaflets connected together. You'd always see them in pairs like that. Almost looks like a butterfly, right? Really cool. I know you're looking at the baby elephant. I'm still looking at the mopane in the background, right? You can see that even at a young age, the baby elephants learn that mopane is a good food source, right? And they see that because they're seeing their parents basically pulling off mopane and eating them. You can tell where elephant herds are very prevalent by the height of the mopane. Tall mopane, probably no elephants. Short mopane, probably elephants, right? So as you look through, so we'd see them tearing off. That's about the only time you'd hear the elephant unless they were trumpeting. You wouldn't hear them walking around, but you'd hear them as they tore off big branches or even grass as they'd tear it out. You'd hear it fairly loud, right? So this is what the mopane looks like on the Mashatu Reserve. multi-stemmed, kind of looks more like a shrub. You wouldn't recognize this as a tree for most folks. And yet, if you see these growing on a hillside where the elephants couldn't get to, these would be impressive looking trees. Very nice. Sometimes also referred to as the organ tree. So if you're looking at how to identify things, these look kind of like lungs, right? The seed pod looks a bit like a kidney. If you open up your kidney, there's your brain, right? So this is the actual seed of the mopane, right? Really cool, right? Really interesting structures. So the mopane itself is also another very, very dense, very hard wood, excellent for firewood and for some building materials, right? But it's difficult to see. And so as one of the things we talk about in wildlife conservation is thinking about what impacts do animals have, or too many animals? Are there too many elephants, right, in a particular area? And how do you go about managing for that, right? If they're basically eating down the food source or disrupting the mopane and you're not getting regeneration, right? What does that mean? How does that mean to conservation? What does that mean for how you deal with wildlife? So not just tracking and finding, but also thinking about if you see mopane in a particular state, what does that mean about the wildlife that's there, right? How do we go about and think about how we might manage those things a little differently to improve the quality of both the habitat for the animals and for ecotourism? Xanthosarsis zambiziaca, the Mashatu tree. Look at this massive trunk. Right, that's huge. It's not really a single trunk, but these tended to grow these kind of multiple trunks at the base, right? But really quite massive. Right? You can see there's a wildebeest in the front. I got him to run out just so you could get some scale and perspective, right? It's a pretty massive tree. And so you'd see these come up all over the landscape, really, really dark foliage. So very, very nice. Right? Here you can see the bark, really kind of a cool texture, kind of this sandy color, flaking bark, right? Deep brown. Really nice. So the trunk itself has a lot of texture to it that's very interesting. And you'd see lots of things. So this is the one in camp. We were told that a rather venomous snake lived in here. We never saw it because it was winter, so it was cool, I think. But apparently there was I forget which kind of snake now, but some large venomous snake lived in this tree. So nobody climbed this tree. Although we did see vervet monkeys, the little monkeys. Tell you, when you live in a bush camp with monkeys, you start to not like monkeys much. Here are the fruit, right? So you can see the berries that come down. The berries are actually used by both humans and animals alike. The vervet monkeys loved these, or at least they loved chewing off the outside and then throwing them at you as you walk through. Yeah, so you'd see monkeys in this tree constantly throughout the day and throughout the night. They poop on a lot of stuff, including occasionally a student or two, as you're kind of underneath this tree, right? And it's in part because of this fruit, so it tends to attract wildlife, right? Here's what the berries look like. You know, you peel that off, and then it's almost like a bean on the inside, dark bean. This is really interesting. So this was actually one of the favorite, this is actually the favorite tree of one of the trees of a student, this particular tree, not just this species. And he turned around and looked at me and was like, this is it. This was like the last few days. He's like, this is it. This is my favorite tree. This one right here. I said, oh, you love the Mashatu? He's like, no, just this one. Just this one Mashatu is my favorite. Really cool tree. Look how massive that is. But what's sort of difficult to see is that all this brown, this is a termite mound. So all these trees, as you'd walk by, you'd go, oh, that's amazing, right? That's a termite mound. So keystone species is a term that I think a lot of people are familiar with from various biology classes, but it essentially means a species that is very important to a particular ecosystem, and without that particular species, that ecosystem would be changed dramatically. Termites are a keystone species. Here, where it's, you know, especially this fall where there's lots of rain, you might have noticed lots of fungus in your yard, or you go in the forest and you see lots of fungus everywhere. Fungus is breaking down wood products and things like that. Here, the termites do this in conjunction with a fungus. So the termites themselves can't digest the cellulose and lignins, and so they take out the dead wood, they carry it in their termite mounds where they're growing fungus. How cool is that? Right? Again, if you were only looking at the elephants, you would miss this, right? But these massive termite mounds that can be decades old, and by some estimates, underground are as big as a football field. So when we first arrived at camp, the students were not allowed to have cell phones or internet access, anything like that. And in fact, it's fairly remote, so cell signal wasn't great. Instructors were allowed to have cell phones and make calls home and things like that. And the instructions, the official camp instructions were, go out to the front of camp, find the termite mound, stand on top of termite mound, you'll get the best cell signal. Right? That's how permanent these things are in the landscape. These aren't mounds that come and go and disappear. So even in Nebraska, we have things like termites, and it's important. You know, you think about termites in relation to your house, and we're always thinking, we got to get rid of the termites, the terrible things, right? But termites in this particular system, without them, woody debris wouldn't really go away very quickly, right? It'd be problematic. And so it's a keystone species. Elephants happen to be another keystone species. Elephant dung is used by a lot, right? Everywhere from people, because it's really good fire starter, which we had students do. I'll talk about more of that on the 18th, right? But also dung beetles and other animals will come through. Elephants don't digest particularly well, which is why they eat for like 18 hours a day, right? And so even though the elephants, right, really important parts of that ecosystem, but termites, right? Think of termites as pests, but really they perform vital functions for ecosystems. Great place for leopards, right? Mashatu trees. You can see leopards hanging out in the Mashatu tree constantly. If you'll notice, this particular leopard is looking at something right there. And if you look really close, you'll notice that's a squirrel tail. Right in that little corner. So if you can't see that, there's a squirrel tail right here. Look at that, so cool. That was the loudest squirrel I have ever heard. He was freaking out the whole time. We're standing there like, great pictures. The squirrel's like, I'm going to die soon. Right? So yeah, really interesting. The other thing is that as you got around trees, you couldn't see animals, but you could hear animals. And you'd hear animals like the squirrel's alarm calling. And if you weren't too loud, they weren't alarm calling at you walking through. They were alarm calling because there's a leopard or a lion or a hyena or some other predator in the area. And so you could utilize these animals in the trees and go, yeah, okay, so something's happening. I should be more aware of what's happening in my surroundings. All because these little animals, mostly hiding up in trees, right? Not that the leopards can't climb up there, but they get a better view, right? And that view and then their alarm calls. Our guides were very, very excellent at knowing what each alarm call meant, when it was more of maybe a mating call or playful, or where it was something is afoot, right? And sort of helping steer us in the right direction and look around. Large-leafed rock fig, cool tree, right? Amazing. This is growing out of, again, this is dolerite, which is an igneous rock, right? So extruded molten lava, hardened. Dolerite you see quite a bit in this part of Botswana. All plants start out as tiny little things though, right? So imagine all of the things in fate that had to happen to get a little fig seed to land in that crack at the right time when there was enough moisture that it could basically sprout, right, and grow. And you can start to see, just below it, little root tendrils, right? There you see another one. Right? That's just amazing. Every time somebody tells me, trees need this much soil, I think that seems wrong, right? I've seen trees grow in all sorts of non-soil-like areas. Very interesting, right? Not all trees, obviously. But here, what we see is that what the roots really need. They need oxygen, they need moisture, right? And they're getting some minerals from the rock itself. Really fascinating. Clinging on, right? An entire forest of them. It's not like that's an oddball. This is the way this thing lives. You'll notice right below here, this is a sandy area. This is called the megalobotrys River. It looks like a river bed. You think, oh, it must be one of those dry rivers. This is an ephemeral river. Water is only there during the wet season. Let me rephrase that. Water is only on top during the wet season. What we would watch elephants do in this riverbed is go out and with their trunk, they would dig a hole about 18 inches deep, and then it was clear water underneath. And in teaching the students some wildlife survival skills, right, part of it was they had to go dig like the elephants and dig up some water, right? So the elephants will not always, or would rarely drink out of these open watering holes if water happened to collect because it wasn't as clean. They would go to this riverbed and dig, and so you just see these holes, almost like a perfect cylinder, right, down. And you'd see elephants sometimes in their trunk look like something, you know, they'd pull it up, and they're 18 inches to 2 feet out of the ground, right, and sit there and drink. Really interesting. So here's just, I just couldn't help but take pictures. I have thousands of these in case you were wondering or would like more at some point, let me know. But look at this, you can just see it. It's like the root system is flowing, like the lava that made the dolerite, right? Flowing over the edges, sticking to the crevices, right? This one on your right, you can see that little tendril of a root just sticking right to that crack. The fact that these things can just hang on is really an impressive thing, right? Trees really have this amazing sort of ability to just sort of surprise us in where they will live and how they will live, right? In what areas they can find. So really, really impressive to watch the nature of these things, right? Here you see another one. Look at how far its root systems are going, and they start these little black pieces here, right? These are really tight mat-like roots that are just adhered to that rock, right? And then they become woody and ropey as they come, but look how they're seeking out anywhere that they can find essentially conducive to growth. So roots, I once wrote in a paper, roots grow randomly in the soil, and then somebody said, you can't say randomly, right? That was a reviewer comment. I said, okay, roots grow multi-directionally in the soil until they find an area conducive to growth, which is what these roots are doing. Multi-directionally, i.e. randomly, right? In the soil or in the substrate to figure out where is conducive to growth. And then as soon as they hit a pocket conducive to growth, they grow and they get more, right? Really, really interesting. And to watch these, right? Really cool. This is one I just thought was especially, look at the pains this thing has gone through to weave in and out between rocks and sort of fall down or almost drip, like looks like it's melting down the rock, right? This particular tree happened to really ignite the imagination of one of the students. Katie could be seen climbing around on every rock formation that we found, occasionally in trees, right? You just saw Katie climbing everywhere. She was assigned the rock fig, right? She would have rather been on the rocks, looking at rocks, playing with rocks, climbing on rocks than doing almost anything else for that trip, right? And so when we started talking about this particular tree, right, it really meant something to her that this tree existed and that she had something in combination with this tree, right? Not to mention the fact that you could actually eat the figs, right, out of this tree. Didn't happen to have any while we were there, but you could, right? So it was a fig, ficus. And so really fascinating tree. And the baobab, right? So there are 9 different species of baobab throughout the world. This is just one of them. Adansonia digitata. And while we were there, you can see how many of us are stacked up. That's me, right? All the students could have probably fit another 1 or 2 there. So these are enormous trees, right? Not as big or as tall as some of the ones you might see out of Madagascar, which is a different species, but very similar in terms of their general appearance. Sometimes referred to as the upside down tree. Lots of myths and legends about how this tree came to look like this. It was so beautiful that, you know, God came and flipped it upside down and put the roots on top so it would be not as beautiful as the gods, right? Things like that. Lots of interesting stories. Digitata, because it's foliage, it's a palmately compound leaf, so you have 5 or so leaflets, right? So kind of a hand or digit-like leaf. Really interesting. So deciduous tree, and we're there in the winter, which is why you don't see any foliage on this particular one, right? This happened to be the very first one that we walked past, so I couldn't help it, right? I just stared and looked at this for a while. Yeah. Yeah, so these are little birds' nests. And I'm not the right person to tell you exactly which ones these are, but basically various types of weaver nests. So there's at least 2 different species in there, I can tell. This lighter colored one is a different species than this sort of darker and larger colored one. It's not just different materials. It is different materials, but it's also different species that make those 2 nests. But I forget which one is which. I was only looking at the tree. No, so you would see these are really interesting. You can see that this one kind of formed out at the base, almost looks like there's two there. Could be that there were two that were planted. Could be that it got nibbled down at some point, kind of formed two stems. We did see multiples of these that were two stemmed. But really, really cool, right? And you could tell we actually did, everyone that we came to, we did a little survey of. So the students are there to learn. They're there to learn about conservation. One of the things important about conservation is understanding what you had. So we had to teach them how to do things like, oh, when you come across information, you have to track it, write it down, right? Not any sort of formalized project, but a basic project to say, oh, this is an iconic species that has an importance to both wildlife and humans that live in this particular area. We should know something about it. How many are there? How big are they? Where are they? How do you conserve it if you don't know where it is? Trees are much easier than animals. They don't move around very often. Right? This is its fruit. That's my hand for perspective, right? So you get a sense of how big that is. Really furry for what that fruit looks like. This one was just still ripening, so it was very hard, actually. To cut this thing open, you actually need a hammer and an axe kind of thing, or a rock and a knife to get through, so very sturdy. The fruit inside is actually used for lots of different purposes. It can be sold, so you can actually buy juices and other things of this fruit. And so the locals will actually collect these, and it's a source of income for some folks. Interesting, we went into a village one of the days, and you know, I'm an urban forester, and so I'm always looking around at the trees that people are planting in their yards, and so many people had baobabs in their yards. I thought, I need to move to Botswana, right? It's like every time I see the redwoods, I think, why? I need to move where these things will grow, right? Very fascinating. Here's right? So these things have an amazing capacity to recover. I usually teach classes in tree biology and things like that. We talk about the fact that trees don't heal, they seal, right? So trees, unlike you, when you get cut, your body actually sends new cells and replaces the old ones. Trees just grow new tissue over it. Baobabs come about as close as I would call to healing in what it looks like they do. They actually send in new tissue, fill in. But interestingly, you see this big hole here? Marcella actually, I think, climbed in there at one point, right? On some of these larger ones, they've been turned into, these hollowed out baobabs have been turned into jail cells, restaurants, libraries, houses, right? Because they live for potentially thousands of years. So there's a question about core samples. These you can't core, in part because maybe they're not a real tree, right? Some research has looked at this and said that baobabs are probably more likely succulents, right? Interesting, although they do have a really woody fibrousness. So they're one of those that it's hard, right? Biology is complicated with lots of areas of gray, right? Here you can see this one was scooped out, looked almost like somebody had taken an ice cream scooper, scooped out a big chunk of it, and the fibrous bark. So not only is the fruit used, but the bark itself can be woven into an incredibly strong rope. So really, really fibrous. But on the flip side, when these trees fall over, they usually disappear within about a year. Incredibly strong when twisted and interwoven, but does not last long in the environment when fallen over. So they disappear off the landscape quickly. Tremendous source of water, right? And so even in the dry season, these are pretty fleshy. You can see, here you see some scarring and things like that. So elephants do like these. They find them tasty, right? It's a good source of water in this sort of desert environment. So here's that same tree, but from a distance, right? Look at that, just completely scooped out. This is one of those trees where if you monitor it year over year, it would be fun to watch. Is this one capable of recovering from this? Is it not? Some of them are obviously hollowed out that people are making things out of. So some of the hollowed out ones are surviving. It would be interesting to watch, right? While we were in Botswana, there was an article that came out in the popular press about a research paper that had just been released looking at this particular species of baobab and its disappearance in southern Africa. Thought to be because of changing weather patterns in terms of the amount of available moisture at the right time of year when these trees are growing, right? Could also be because of animal predation, right? If somebody took a big chunk out of you like that, your survival rate would go down, I imagine. Well, mine would, right? This was Baobab Alley. which is a cool space. I mean, we walked into this little spot, and it's in between two rocky dolomite areas, and you'd come through and you just saw a line of baobabs, right? Really cool. To come here in the morning, so we'd usually get up, I'd get up at about 4 a.m. We'd be out walking by 6:30 in the morning. And so to be walking out just as the sun is coming up over Baobab Alley, and you're out there just kind of meandering through, stopping, occasionally traffic jams of elephants would happen, and you'd stop and wait for a herd of elephants to move past, right? This is the little map that we created. So you can see basically Baobab Alley is on the far right there, where there's just a big cluster. You can't even see all the trees that were there. In total, we mapped around 70 trees, right? Really basic project, just use Google Maps, right? Not very complicated. We mapped them all to give you some idea of the extent of where we were walking. This little brown area down here, that's where our camp was. Solomon's Wall was was where we saw some of those rock figs. And then you can see, so we walked all of that area. We walked, right? So really fun to be walking out after the first few days of being a little freaked out, walking around with guys with 50 caliber rifles. It was really amazing to walk out during the day, right? So this picture, this is two stems, two baobabs. So we said Okwa, who is, I won't do this justice, but Okwa is a very quiet, very contemplative guy, and always had something fantastic to say. We said, Okwa, can you take our picture, right? He said, oh, sure, no problem. Always very accommodating. Takes the picture. Looks, I said, it'd turn out, he looks down and he goes, that's frickin' beautiful. Right, Okwa was picking up our speech patterns, not mine so much. He's a really cool guy, very funny, very interested in sort of helping everybody understand the land that he loves and grew up in, right? Very important. Here is a tree. This is a very historic tree. This is on top of a rock formation called Mamagua. And this is called Cecil Rhodes Baobab. Cecil Rhodes is an English guy that came through, and basically he parlayed a deal with a bunch of the chiefs at the time. So they did 100 or so years ago, but came through and basically wanted to put a railroad through here. And so looked at it and said, hey, I will pay you and we'll organize. And so the baobab, and I tried to take a picture of it, but it's really hard, it doesn't stand out because now the tree is sort of growing over that. But they carved their initials in the baobab, right? As that was the sign of their treaty. So you can still see that. This tree is still there. It's kind of a hike to get up to this, and so it's a popular spot for the main camp where tourists generally are. There's a few miles from here. And so you'd see people occasionally driving out, but otherwise it was mostly for this sort of tourism, right? So not only do the baobab have all these very useful things for both animals and people, but there are some of them that have these very iconic, lasting cultural and historical significance and relevance, right? Really amazing. This is John Carroll, the director of the School of Natural Resources. This is what happens when you steal my camera. Your pictures you take show up on PowerPoint slides. So John was going to be here today. I'm sort of sad that he had to miss it. But John, we have to thank John a lot. He's been doing trips out to Botswana and this portion of Africa for the last 20 years. And so a lot of the relationships that we have with people and the cultures and a lot of what we know and are able to do is really thanks in part to John and what he's done in order to get students and to get people in the Botswana area, right, to continue to go. So really fun. There's another, I have to dig up the other couple of photos of him. They're even worse. So that's all I have for you, but I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions that you might have, if you have any. And here's my contact info, of course, if anybody wants to